Hello, folks, and welcome to the latest installment of AP Government Video Lessons. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Today, we are looking at the ever-evasive bureaucracy. Okay, this faceless government entity that is actually known as the unofficial fourth branch of government because it has so much power and so much control over how government works, how laws are enforced, whether or not they're enforced even. So this is good. It promises to be very interesting and to actually give you a bird's eye view of how and why the government functions or doesn't, as it were. So without further ado, here we go. Hello, machine. There we go. Okay, so review. I cannot overemphasize this enough. You must know the branches of government, right? So we've talked about the legislative, we talked about the executive and the judicial, and now we're on to the unofficial fourth branch, the bureaucracy, right? And we obviously have to know what these things do. So we should know at this point what the other three branches do, right? They're right there in case you forgot. But today our focus is on the bureaucracy. So this entity creates regulations that help enforce the laws based on instructions from legislative and executive branches. However, if those instructions are purposely vague, which they often are, the bureaucracy in effect winds up being the lawmaking and law enforcing branch of government. So this is where this is why, rather, you want to pay particular attention to how this particular area of government functions, because they have a lot more power than they should have, and they're unelected. They're appointed, but unelected. We don't elect these people. They are chosen by the people that we elect. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. So here we go. Here's a breakdown of checks and balances on the three branches. Now you'll notice that there is no bureaucracy there, right? Because there are no constitutional checks and balances built in because the bureaucracy did not exist when the Constitution was created. So the only check and balance we have on the bureaucracy is in effect the legislative and executive branches. However, as we've come to know, well, you know what? I'll leave it up to you. I don't know how effective it's been. In some areas, extremely effective. In other areas, not so much. But we'll get to that when we get to the policy area. All right, and of course, divided government. This is also a review. We have separation of powers, right? So that's just a review. I want everybody to keep this in mind as we go forward. And now let's talk about what it is and how it's organized. So first off, what is it? Effectively, any bureaucracy is an administrative system. Okay, they show up in government, all forms of government. Like I teach in New York City, right? There's a New York City Department of Education. That is one mammoth bureaucracy, let me tell you. And they divide work into specific categories, right? So that there's this hierarchy. You have this person at the top who's, technically in control of all of it. And then there are these branches that come off the top. And then off of those branches are still other branches, and then still other branches. Well, I'll show you a chart in a minute. And this divides work into specific categories that are carried out by particular departments of non-elected officials. So offices have very specific missions, and employees are assigned responsibility based on merit, knowledge, and experience. That's the idea anyway. So Max Weber is like the bureaucracy guy. He came up with a theory about how bureaucracies operate, and this is sort of a very simple breakdown of what that looks like. So bureaucracy is characterized. It's partially defined by rules and procedures, a lot of specialization and division of labor. You have a hierarchy of authority, and that's what I was describing before. We have the person at the top, and then other people below them, and then other people below them, and so on and so forth. And it's just like this massive flow chart, right? You have technically qualified personnel. They have separate positions and tend to be incumbent. And we keep track of what's happening through written communication and records. Massive, massive records. The paperwork. You cannot imagine when you become a teacher, nobody tells you about the paperwork. Nobody tells you about that. Like, it's like, whoa. But anyway, I digress. So, this legitimate base of authority comes from this concept of rational legal authority, like the idea that it's rational, that it makes sense, that it's logical to have an organization like this to carry out all of these tasks that have to happen, and that this authority is legal. It's conferred upon the folks in the bureaucracy by government. So there's a little bit of breakdown of Max Weber's theory. Now, what defines it? It's got a mission, like we talked about. It's specific roles and responsibilities. There's hierarchical decision making, ascending levels of authority. This explains why I can't say show a full movie in class unless I get an approval from my supervisor, for example. Right. You have experts in a particular issue area. Like I'm a part of this bureaucracy. I'm an expert in social studies. I teach social studies, right? And then there's this concept of bureaucratic culture that it self perpetuates. Basically, everybody involved in the bureaucracy begins to become such an essential part of it that they do whatever they can to further it because they are a part of it, even if they disagree with how it functions. So, what is the role of a bureaucracy in government specifically? Well, they're in charge of defining problems, identifying possible solutions, implementing the best course, the preferred course. Whether or not that's the best course is subject to debate. And then they assist in evaluating the policies after they've been carried out. So, in theory, what should happen is okay, we define the problem, right? And then we have all these solutions. Of these solutions, the number three seems to be the best one, so let's do that. Then we implement number three, and then we evaluate, right? We look and see how is number three working? Is it in fact solving the problem? So in theory, if number three isn't cutting it, then we cancel number three and we try number two or whatever, right? But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes these preferred policy courses, even though they're massively unsuccessful, they stay in effect for a number of reasons. We'll talk about that a little later. So what are the, like, in the perfect world, in an ideal scenario, what are goals and standards of bureaucracy, right? Well, they promote the public interest. That's their sole purpose. That is their reason for being, the reason for existence. They provide services, and they have to accomplish the tasks they are given by the executive and legislative branches. Now, in theory, they're efficient, cost effective. There's never any waste and there's no corruption, right? And they're supposed to be open, transparent, right? So, and the government has worked hard to an extent to make this a reality, this openness at least. So we have these acts like the Sunshine Act, the Federal Register Act, the Freedom of Information Act, and the Administrative Procedure Act. We'll talk about these in more detail in class. But all of these acts here, these laws, to some degree, involve transparency, involve the bureaucracy opening its doors and its books so that the public can look at whatever they want, so that they can ensure that they are in fact efficient, cost effective, and there's not waste, and they can find corruption when it crops up. We've had varying degrees of success with all of this, but again, we'll get to that later. So, what are federal bureaucracies? These are a collection of executive branch departments. So, the federal bureaucracy is directly operated by the executive branch, but it gets its direct instructions via legislation. So, that comes from the legislative branch. The legislative branch also has considerable oversight over the bureaucracy. So at this point, we have nearly 9 million federal employees. They're supposed to be transparent and equally fair to everybody, and it's supposed to be orderly and predictable. So responsibility is established by law, right? That comes from Congress. Implementation is carried out by bureaucrats, but that is overseen by the executive branch, right? Bureaucrats in the bureaucracy, but the executive branch, this is part of its enforcement authority under the Constitution, is to direct the bureaucracy. So this is, just to give you a brief example of how this works, is what it looks like. So you have the president here, you have Congress here. So the president, you have the executive office of the president, the Office of Management and Budget, which the president has to come up with a budget, present it to Congress, even though Congress is in charge of the purse. So Congress ultimately has discretion over what happens with the budget, whether they adopt the president's en toto, like all of it, or if they take parts of it, or if they ignore it completely. That's up to Congress. But the Office of Management and Budget, part of its role is to create the president's budget, but also it oversees the implementation of whatever appropriations Congress dictates. And you have the National Security Council. That's what the NSC stands for, National Security Council. Now, also part of the bureaucracy and under the president are the cabinet departments. So that's Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Education, Agriculture, Interior. Like we have a lot of cabinet, Homeland Security. We have a lot of cabinet departments, right? So those are all actually part of the bureaucracy as well. And then another link to the president are these government corporations. Amtrak and Postal Services are corporations, but they're under the purview of the federal government and, of course, of Congress. As you can see, all of these are connected to Congress directly, right? Except for this one right over here, the Executive Office of the President is really just the president's deal. We have independent regulatory commissions, Security and Exchanges Commission, which oversees the stock market, Federal Communications Commission, which regulates things like language on television, right? And then we have independent executive agencies. CIA, NASA are examples of that. So this is just to see like the sort of interconnected nature of the bureaucracy. The president and Congress both have their hands in all of these bureaucratic agencies and departments. Now you really want to like go blind, right? Well, let's look at this. So this is a lovely little breakdown of bureaucracy. So I mean, this is huge. This is, I mean, it's obscene almost, right? So you have Congress over here, right? Then you have the executive branch here, then you have the judicial branch here. Now, spinning off of the executive branch, because technically the executive branch is in charge with enforcing the law, and bureaucrats do that. They enforce the law. So you have all these departments. These are all the cabinet departments I was talking about. And they're in charge of their very particular area: Defense Department, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, things like that. Then we have all these independent establishments and government corporations. Like, whoa. So here's a close-up view of that, just so you can get a better look at that. You can pause the video and take a look. You do not have to write all of this down. You don't have to write all of this down, but you should understand the connection, okay? So, like, for example, see this little thing right there? That connects to the executive branch, not to the legislative. So please keep that in mind. And these are all the cabinet departments. And here's a close-up view of all these various, these are all part of the federal government. And they're all in charge of particular things. That's a lot of stuff for the federal government to be in charge of. That's a lot. And for one president, one guy, to be effectively in charge of all of that, maybe we have some unrealistic expectations of our presidents. Like, can you really? Like, let's go back a little bit. As the president, one guy, even if you're an awesome guy, I say guy because we haven't had a woman yet, or a person of the non-binary persuasion. I mean, really, maybe we're expecting a little too much. I want you to think about that. Think about the sheer, just looking at this, the sheer size of the federal government. It's massive, just massive. Okay, moving on. So let's go into deeper detail in the organization. So in the federal bureaucracy, the cabinet departments, each department is expert in a specific policy area. So ideally, those appointments to the head of those cabinets would be people who, like, I don't know what they're doing, right? Like, for example, I would love one day to see a teacher as a head of the secretary of education. It might be nice to have an actual teacher, someone in the classroom who knows what that's like, be the secretary of education, maybe. I don't know, just a thought. Then you have these independent executive agencies, and they perform services for the executive branch. They are established by Congress, and they have these executive agencies do have separate status outside of the executive branch. So they're almost like equally responsive to the executive branch and Congress. They are given a very specific mandate, and they perform a service function. It's not regulatory. Like, they're not looking to check to see if people are doing what they're supposed to do. That's like if they're following regulations or rules. Their job, like, for example, the CIA, their job, the Central Intelligence Agency, their job is to make sure that we know all the information we need to know about what's going on outside of the United States. So for example, if we need to know when Russia's going to invade Ukraine, the CIA is going to be all over that, right? They're our intelligence, our spy network, basically, right? NASA is all about exploring space, what's going on outside the planet. That's NASA's specific function. Then we have these independent regulatory agencies, okay? And they're still independent agencies, but these people are in charge of making sure that regulations that have been passed by Congress are actually enforced. So they regulate a specific area of business or the economy, right? So the Federal Communications Commission, as I mentioned earlier, that's public airwaves. So if somebody drops an F-bomb on, network TV, somebody at the FCC is going to reach out to the network and say, hey, that'll be $5,000 fine, please, or whatever it is, because you're not allowed to say that. And if you say bad words on the television, you get fined. The Federal Reserve Board, that's in charge of our banking system and our money supply. Once appointed and seated, members can't be removed without cause. So they can't be fired. So the chairman of the Federal Reserve, chairperson, even if the president doesn't like them, the president can't fire them. Congress can't either, unless there's been misconduct. They break the law, right? But otherwise, they serve out their term. They are directed by presidential appointees, right? So these people are independent and supposed to be removed from political influence, and it's based on expertise. But in this day and age, is anything really removed from political influence? So these independent regulatory commissions are administrative units that have responsibility for monitoring and regulation of ongoing economic activities. So the EPA, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, they are going to. There's also the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They deal with nuclear power plants and making sure that's okay. EPA folks are running around making sure that companies aren't polluting, and if they are, they get fined. They're checking up on like pipelines that are being built and making sure they're being built properly so that we don't have an oil spill. Uh, the Securities and Exchange Commission is monitoring the stock market and making sure that people aren't engaging in illegal acts like insider trading, things like that. So the Federal Trade Commission is also important. These people deal with monopolies. So like if a company gets too big or it's taking over too much of the market, they come in and they investigate and see if we need to engage in what's called antitrust. So if you wanted to like force Facebook to break into pieces, like some politicians are forcing, now they're like Meta or something. I don't know. I can't keep track. Ugh. But if you wanted to break them up into smaller companies so they don't have so much power, it's the Federal Trade Commission you're going to. Okay, because that would be dealing with unfair competition, right? The Federal Communications Commission again deals with regulating the airwaves, and all these things are examples of things that they do. You can read. I don't need to read this to you. You can pause the video and write these items down. And again, Security Exchange Commission. I talked about. I don't believe I mentioned. No, I didn't mention the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. These people deal with everything that's there. But there's a lot of commissions. Do you need to memorize all of this? No, you do not. You absolutely do not. But you do need to pick, I would say, two or three and know them well, so that you have something to pull from when you're on the exam. But you can pause the video and write these down. Okay, now we're into government corporations. So these are businesses that are run by the government. So Postal Service, Amtrak, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. They do not have stockholders, so they're not for profit. Okay, their purpose is not to make a profit. Okay, their mission is to implement laws that are passed by Congress. That's it. They're not there to make a profit. They're simply there to implement laws. And all of these government corporations have to be chartered through an act of Congress. Even though they may be overseen by the executive, they can only exist via Congress. The president can't create willy-nilly. But that's it for part one. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.